Welcome everyone joining us here tonight, both in person and remotely via Zoom. For those of you I haven't met before, I'm Clara Shepherd, Member Engagement Manager at the Inn. So thank you for coming along to our event tonight, How to Mentor and Be Mentored. The talk should last about an hour, and that includes a Q&A session, and it's scheduled to finish at 7:15, where we'll host a drinks reception next door for in-person attendees. If you are joining us remotely, please type any questions that you have for our speaker using the Q&A button on the Zoom banner. Those attending in person will be invited to raise their hand following the talk, and we'll bring over a microphone. So I'm now going to hand you over to Laura Gould of King's Chambers. Laura co-chairs the Inn's Social Mobility Subcommittee and is also the Inn's representative of the Northern Circuit. And Laura will be chairing tonight's event.
Thank you very much, Clara. Yes, as Clara says, I'm Laura and I'm the co-chair of the Social Mobility Subcommittee, and I'm very pleased to see Rabbi, Susanna and my co-chair Chris here tonight supporting this event. Our speaker for tonight is Cath Brown, and she is a former barrister having practiced for over 15 years in the same chambers as me, King's Chambers in Manchester. She left the bar and has moved into coaching and training, setting up her own business, Skillful Conversations, back in 2018. She's worked globally as a trainer and coach, and in particular supports, challenges and empowers legal professionals, including in the sorts of skills that we're going to learn about this evening. She's taken that experience from the courtroom and she's used it in her various coaching sessions and workshops, including how to mentor and be mentored, which she's delivered to chambers throughout the country and has tweaked even further for us to hopefully provide a benefit to all of our members at Lincoln's Inn who are joining us this evening. As Clara said, this is being run as a hybrid event. It is also being recorded, and the recording will be made available to attendees afterwards and on the website. So please feel free to share it with your colleagues in Lincoln's Inn who you feel might find it useful. Well, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Cath, who will deliver tonight's session, and then there'll be time for questions and answers afterwards. And as Clara said, if those online could put the questions in the Q&A rather than the chat function, that would be very helpful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. And before Laura disappears from the screen, can you just give me a thumbs up, Laura, if you can hear me okay? Brilliant, excellent, thank you. Good evening, everybody. I am speaking to you from Manchester. I'm actually speaking to you from not very far away from Manchester Airport. So I am going to walk the walk. One of the themes I want to talk to you about is boundaries and managing expectations from the start. So I will just explain that I've been delivering an all-day conference today. I'm slightly conscious I'm going to wave at somebody as they walk past, because virtually everybody walking past me is somebody I've spent today with. I'm going to try and keep that under control, and hopefully the sound will be okay, and we can get through and do some questions. The final management of expectations is I've also committed myself to a 7:15 event, because you can leave the bar, but perhaps you can never leave the bar. And I am as guilty as many of you, I'm sure, at overcommitting. So without further ado, I can probably skip fairly quickly, I hope. Let me just take, I've got the wrong menu up. Now in a second. There we go. That part we've probably done, and I don't like the idea of that being on a massive screen in real life, so we will move on from that. And this is just something to think about, really. because we've probably all had mentors. Maybe we've mentored informally. I think if we're going with full disclosure, Laura and I probably had something of that relationship, and probably have it in a reverse mentoring relationship now, which I'll talk about shortly. So think about people that might have mentored you, and any informal mentoring you might have done, and think about how it worked. Did it work well? Did it drift? Did it turn into a coffee every 6 months, or did it provide you with real value? Because as with so many things, particularly at the bar, we can learn from others, can't we? Some people it comes very naturally. Some people need to work at it a little bit more. And I should just say as well, before we go too much further, that the theme of this really will be, if you can find or be a good mentor, it can make a massive difference in both directions. I'm drawn back to what is sadly now, I think, an internet meme, but I'm assured it is an African proverb, which is, if you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And I did, just in the spirit of thinking, some of my favourite mentors are appearing on screen now. Hopefully, you're probably desperately young, but the one at the bottom left is Mr. Miyagi from The Karate Kid, if you don't recognise him. And he mentored Daniel's son brilliantly and innovatively, I would argue. We better think first of all about what mentoring is. There are lots of definitions, in the same way you could buy a leadership book. I think something like 400 are published a day. There is a lot of talk and theory about mentoring. And as we were discussing before we started, really this is about me having read the books and done the diploma and passing on the key bits. So EMCC are a European mentoring organisation. It's the European Mentoring and Coaching Council. You can see their definition on screen, hopefully, which is that mentoring is a developmental process in which a more experienced person shares their knowledge with a less experienced person in a specific context through a series of conversations. And you can also potentially take away the more and the less and have it as a learning partnership between peers. Julie Starr is an author who's written extensively on mentoring and coaching. And she went with a distinct relationship. I think that relationship part's quite important, where one person, the mentor, supports the learning, development, and progress of another person, the mentee. And I'll introduce those terms because it just makes the language a little bit easier. A mentor provides support by offering information, advice, and assistance in a way that empowers the mentee. That's a theme we'll come back to as well. It's generally speaking, when done well, is not necessarily about telling, controlling, converting the person into a mini you, being converted. There's a degree of empowerment, hopefully. Eric Parslow, who runs the coaching and mentoring school that I went to, says mentoring is to support and encourage people to manage their own learning in order that they may maximise their potential, develop their skills, improve their performance, and become the person they want to be. All good stuff. When I've worked with chambers and different organisations, we've usually got it down to this. A relationship, short or long term, usually between two people, where person A has more or different experience and knowledge than person B. Person A is willing to help person B to learn, and person B is willing to accept that help. So I've mentioned a couple of times that I do coaching. The real thing about coaching is that you enable others to find their own solutions, whereas with mentoring, we do value the knowledge and experience of the mentor. The word, I am told by Julie Starr, comes from Greek mythology. Mentor was a friend of Odysseus and was left to watch over Odysseus' son and his palace, whilst Odysseus left for the Trojan War. So in that sense, Thinking about it perhaps as a father figure, a parent figure, an advisor, a wiser elder, although I don't think you have to be older, and we'll come on to that. So, second part of the definition, is person A willing and able to let person B have control over their learning, to not dictate? And I do think most of the learning generally is through conversation rather than, for example, role plays or drafting a set of papers or something of that nature. It tends to be a conversation, a series of conversations, I suppose, through which the mentor assists the mentee. But there's a balance, isn't there, between them finding their own way and them benefiting from that experience, the experience of the person who has agreed to be their mentor. Part of the skill, I think, is to recognise that you will need different styles for different people, or as a mentee that you should perhaps try and give feedback or request different styles. So there is a real benefit in people passing on what they know, isn't there? There's a real benefit in that person being able to say, I had that problem. I once had my first appearance in the Court of Appeal. I can tell you what helped me. But a coaching style, asking questions to help others find their own answers, can be a little bit more valuable. It's a bit like, I suppose, the giving the man the fish or the teaching the person to fish. Are you going to get the ability to problem solve, the ability to empower yourself and so on? Possibly you get that a bit more from a coaching style, but again, it might depend on the topic. And a key thing that a mentor can often do, if it's right for that relationship, is act as a more senior member of that network. They can introduce you, they can make recommendations. Perhaps when the time comes, they even write references, or perhaps assist with interviews and so on. I'll address this misconception when I am helping legal professionals, both solicitors and barristers. I think, and again, perhaps this is a discussion for another time, I'm just going to throw out a controversial opinion and move on. I think sometimes we're a little bit behind the rest of the commercial world in embracing development and learning, possibly because we're too busy. But I think there is perhaps a misconception that needing mentoring is a sign of weakness. Perhaps people called to the bar in the 50s, the 60s, the 70s say, well, I just pressed on and I worked hard and that was it. That's what got me where I am today. Again, we might go back to that proverb. Maybe they could have got further. Maybe they could have developed themselves more. So a few examples there for you of people who were mentored. Again, some of those might be more controversial than others. They might not be paths we want to go down necessarily. But I think embracing the idea that we can help each other and we can learn from others in either direction is a powerful one, and it's one that can make a difference. Again, in the thinking you were doing earlier, you might have thought back to a school teacher who perhaps took you under their wing, somebody who opened doors or at least opened your eyes to different opportunities, different horizons. I believe it's really valuable. We can perhaps get in the Q&A as to whether it's something that you value. And these are, in my view, the benefits for the mentee. I think there are other benefits. There are benefits for the mentor as well, which I'll come on to. But I think if you just, we talk a lot perhaps about things like a boat without a route. If you just drift, you are less likely to achieve as much. If you have goals, if you have some accountability, did you apply for that scholarship? If you think more about your relationships with people, I think good relationships tend not to happen by accident. We tend to have to work at them a little, and having a mentor can help you through that, can help you just really have that direction, that purpose, And it can help you, you know, even in different ways. As Laura indicated, I've left the bar. And when I look back, I suppose I could look at it two ways. One is, would I have left the bar if I'd have had a strong mentor at the time? Of those mentors I did have, I think they did empower me to make my own choices and to think about what was right for me and what suited me. It was my decision, nobody else's, but I think it really helped me make a purposeful decision rather than just staying on a treadmill I didn't want to be on, or ending up in a different role accidentally. And again, it's always helpful, I think, just to pause and think about, have you seen that, either for yourself or for somebody else? And let's not forget that there are benefits in both directions. The next two, I think, slides are taken from a research paper that was published in the Harvard Business Review. And it was about the fulfillment that mentors get. Again, you might have experienced this yourself. You might have helped somebody, opened a door for somebody. You might, and this is where we talk about perhaps thinking about this in reverse, you might have learned as much as them. I suppose coincidentally in a traditional mentoring relationship, but many of the big corporates, and I have seen actually, I can't remember if it's on Twitter or LinkedIn, but there is a QC who has publicly shared their experience of reverse mentoring. I'm really sorry, I can't remember the name, but the QC has been working with, I can't either remember whether they're a junior barrister or a student. But if I think about the stuff I would like to know more about now, I would like to know more about inclusivity. I would like to know more about gender issues. I would like to know more about pronouns. I would like to know more about tech. I would like to feel perhaps more at ease with a hybrid audience, because this is new for me. So just because I am decades out of university doesn't mean I haven't got anything to learn. And as I say, the big corporates will have reverse mentoring schemes in place. They'll go further often. They'll have a position on their board for under 25s, and some of your executive committees may do the same. So just being open to how other people think, if we could stop all those horrible stereotypes about Gen X and baby boomers and millennials and that kind of stuff, if we talk to each other and we build these relationships, and I think maybe we do that one by one. Who wouldn't like lower levels of anxiety? I think often if you get to a senior position and you feel comfortable with the difficulty of the work that you are doing, then perhaps having another way of achieving fulfillment is a real benefit. So these people were surveyed. They said that those who served as mentors described their job as being more meaningful than those who did not. Now, I'm not here to encourage you all to immediately sign up to be mentors, although I think the chair will be talking to you about that later. But do bear in mind that, yes, it's a time commitment. Yes, I'm going to talk to you about some sort of ground rules to make it work well. But don't forget there's a benefit, and a benefit on top of, you know, the lovely altruistic helping others. Now, this is another slide where, as you look at the slide, I would like you just to be thinking. We're going to try and put in place some rules about how to make this go right. Some of those rules apply more widely as well, which is great. But I certainly have spoken to people who have been put in touch with a mentor through a scheme, whatever it might be, maybe a bar association, maybe a circuit, something like that, and outside the bar as well, I freely admit. And then you know, I might say to them, perhaps in a coaching session, have you considered a mentor? And they might say, oh, I had one, but we never met. Or I had one, but we only met every so often. I had one, but it wasn't working for me, so we stopped. That's where I think the lack of honesty comes in. I think we're going to talk as we move through this short presentation about the importance of honesty, feedback and reflection. And as a lovely trio, they are skills and attributes that certainly are transferable. Egos, I mean, I know that we don't have egos at the bar, but perhaps that happens in other professions. Perhaps the mentor's ego, the need to tell, the wish to tell, the wish to throw down solutions from on high, perhaps that does occasionally get in the way. And then there's the flip side of that, isn't there? There's the mentee thinking, well, I've got this senior person, why don't I have all the answers now? Not taking on sufficient responsibility, not doing the work between sessions sometimes, not preparing for sessions. Or potentially the mentor becomes something else. I don't think the mentor should consistently long-term fulfill any of these in isolation. And I suppose I'm couching that a little bit because the one at the end is meant to represent friendship. And I don't think there's anything wrong with a mentoring relationship becoming a strong friendship over time. But that shouldn't be its sole purpose. It shouldn't be its sole defining characteristic. Just to explain those rather weird PowerPoint graphics. Also, I don't think they should be a crutch. They're not someone you just run to when something's gone wrong. Hopefully you've got friends or a mum or a partner for that. They're not there just to hold you up. They're not there, I don't think, to lecture or give you all their law knowledge, because you'll have to go away and do the reading and the research for that. And nor are they, I think what that is meant to be is a therapy room. They are not meant to be your therapist, your counsellor. Of course, if you end up in a relationship as a mentee with someone you trust, perhaps you will go to them when you've had a terrible day in court. Perhaps you will see if they can offer you some words of advice or comfort at that point. But that shouldn't be all they're doing if it's going to work constructively. Okay. So how can you make this work well? Now, this is where we could take ourselves off in lots of different directions. I've tried to get things down onto one slide and then we'll elaborate on it a little bit. But I don't think we need to overcomplicate this. I don't think we need to create a new department in Chambers or something like that. That top bullet point about doing simple things consistently, again, great advice for life, works really well with mentoring. Think about what you're going to talk about. If you just turn up, meet the person in Chambers after court, have a coffee, whatever it might be, and you as a mentee haven't thought about what you want to achieve that day, then the chances are that conversation will drift. Maybe it'll start with the weather. Maybe it'll end up in what the Metropolitan Police are or aren't investigating. Who knows? But a good rule for simplicity, and we'll talk about setting these boundaries at the beginning shortly, is to have the mentee turn up to every session, could be remote of course, turn up to every session with a focus, something that they want to discuss. You're going to learn through a conversation. What's that conversation going to be about? Make sure you meet. And again, I think when I work with barristers on this, I am much more flexible than when I work with people in the corporate world, because I know that there might need to be changes to this. You might have a time and date set and you might need to change it. Follow the basic rules of courtesy, let them know as soon as possible, and rearrange the next one. Rearrange the altered date, the transferred date, the adjourned date, because otherwise it will drift. 6 months will go by and you're then perhaps both a bit embarrassed to pick up the phone, you think maybe it's drifted. That's the sort of thing we want to avoid through honest, open communication. I say keep it brief, not to, sort of diminish your wish to learn or wish to help, but I think your time should be focused. If people are giving up their time to help and people want that time, then be focused about it. Set a time that works for you. It's much easier to think I have to give up 45 minutes every month than it is to think, what am I getting into? Stick to the basic processes, which we'll talk about in a sec. That next point, develop the ask not tell habit for the mentor and be prepared to do your own thinking for the mentee. You can see that that's addressing one of those pitfalls, can't you? Of depending or just sitting listening to war stories about what it was like in the good old days. So I think for the mentor, asking, at least giving the mentee the opportunity to come up with their own solution first is a really good habit to get into. So if they say to you, got this really difficult cross-examination coming up, don't know how to attack this, never cross-examined an expert before, then instead of launching into your top tips on cross-examining experts, could your first point of call be, well, what do you think you should do? What do you think the key points are? How do you think you should prepare? Because you're naturally then empowering them and you're getting them used to the flip side of that tip. You're getting them used to doing their own thinking so that they don't ring you and ask you where they find bus times or whatever it might be. That's an only slightly exaggerated example. You get them used to thinking for themselves so that the time you spend together is really valuable. Remember, it's about learning, not just war stories. Be aware of boundaries, set the boundaries first. Come on to that in a minute. And don't be too hard on yourselves. Don't expect miracles. Take the good. Don't be overly critical. So thinking about what you do at the start, I think there's a real benefit to having boundaries in place from the outset. In general, I do a lot of work around difficult conversations as well. In general, many difficult conversations can be avoided if you have one not very difficult conversation at the beginning, so that both parties then know what to expect. Now, there is, we're talking in coaching and mentoring about this being a contracting stage. We don't concern ourselves with things like consideration and an intention to create legal relations or any of that stuff, but we call it contracting because we are agreeing how we work with each other. And I entered into a mentoring contract through the EMCC with a mentor, gave up her time to help me start my coaching business. And we put it in a template and I formally set out, I want help with the first 12 months of my business, finding clients, working with clients ethically, forming support structures. I want help from someone who's done it. And that lovely lady gave up her time to do it. But I filled the form in that said what I wanted to achieve. We discussed together on an initial call how frequent our contact would be. We discussed together initially, would it be remote? Could I phone her in between the sessions? Those sorts of things. So that contracting side, I think I've got a separate slide for in a moment, is thinking about these sorts of things and then thinking about how formally you want to agree those things. I would very strongly suggest, having read all the books, that this can be informal, doesn't have to be a 4-page written document, but you need to be thinking about, have you ticked these boxes, I suppose I'm referring to it as a checklist, before you get started. So do we know what we're doing? Does the mentee know what they want to achieve? there's no hard and fast rules, I don't think, about when you should work with a mentor or mentee. Often it's at points of transition, out of pupillage into junior tenancy, perhaps leading up to applications for silk or the judiciary, perhaps coming back after a career break or some sort of family leave, those sorts of things. Are we clear about what's going on? Rather than ticking a box, just having mentoring for the sake of it. Have you got that relationship where the mentee has been helped to find their own solutions as a resourceful person? And then the last two there are, I think, useful things to think about if you were, for example, setting up a mentoring scheme in Chambers. Do you both have someone to turn to? You might have a senior person, a junior person. You might want something in place, a safeguard to address the balance of power. Not because I think anything's desperately likely to go wrong, but you want the mentee to feel safe to open up. So if you have thought in advance about things like ethics, that can probably help you. That's our non-legal contracting, some questions to ask yourself, so you can look back at those. We'll send this out to you. And this is where we really get into some questions to ask yourself about boundaries. How frequently will we meet? If you don't agree that at the beginning, then perhaps the mentee is going to be left nervously thinking, should I ring them after 4 months? Should I ring them after 6 months? So agree it, avoid that, take away the doubt. What if that becomes too much? How do you change this? And then I think that can either party just pick up the phone. That's possibly not a yes, no, but at least address it, because you wouldn't, as a mentor, want to find yourself with a mentee who thinks that Sunday lunchtime is an ideal time to just have an informal chat, would you? And rather than that turning into a difficult conversation about home life and boundaries, set the boundaries at the beginning. So lots around time, lots around commitments, frequency, I think they're important. If you are doing this with other professionals, which you probably are, then think about confidentiality. What we would often do is think about it's confidential unless, and then we usually would get into things like risk of harm to self or others. So be purposeful. Matching is interesting. It's probably outside the scope of this short talk, but how do you find the right one? That's something to think about. There's no point in entering into a mentoring relationship if you don't think you can be helped, or perhaps help each other. And again, if you're doing that in Chambers, you have to, I think, be quite careful to have some scrutiny, to have some neutrality about it, to not just go off what you think about that person when you last went out for dinner with them, but to look really at what the needs are. And in formal schemes, you would be filling in application forms and being matched by a third party, much the same way as you'd apply for a job. Again, not saying you need that degree of formality, but can you take something from it to think about what you do before you commit? Is this the right person? If you feel like they can't possibly have any idea what you're going through as a mentee, maybe not. Again, maybe you push yourself, but think about those things. As I say, I don't think this has to be difficult or complicated or draining. I think it can be enriching and fulfilling, but you will get those benefits more if you think about this sort of topic at the beginning. What will you do? Before you sign up, can you agree to do these things? Can you make the time? Can you offer the challenge or the stretch? Be willing to recognise they have a point of view. They might know better about some things. Be enthusiastic and open and honest. And I really like that next one. Can you encourage, support, empathise and celebrate successes? let's look at what goes right as well as what goes wrong. And can you maintain their confidentiality? You've got to have trust to work together like this. What can you do to build and keep that trust? And then they're sort of the flip side of each of those. Still about making time, still about enthusiasm, openness, honesty, respecting your mentor's time and knowledge. And as I say, I just think the way it works better if it's the mentee that prepares for the sessions and the mentee that has to work on those actions in between. Okay. I'm moving my little window. And that's what that possibly looks like, facilitating learning. This will be, again, a blast. Lots of you, many of you who train or do whatever, you know that training others is a skill in itself. So this isn't a whole workshop on how to facilitate others' learning, but a few things you can do. Pass some power to them, let them drive the agenda. Recognise their responsibility for results and progress. You can't go in and do that cross-examination. You can't fill in that application form ethically, I don't think. And I often say to others in all sorts of contexts that a really good thing to do for your mental health is to recognise that other people's opinion of you is none of your business. And I twisted that here a little bit to say what your mentee chooses to do, what they choose to learn, what they choose to ignore. When it comes to the end of the day, you can't do anything about it. So put it in the not my business category. You are not responsible for, I wrote, as you can probably see, I wrote that mentor is not responsible for fixing everything. And I thought, actually, they're not responsible for fixing anything, but they can help. So there's a degree there, I suppose, of staying in your box to preserve your own sanity, I guess. And then for the mentors, momentarily, how do you do that? I've already mentioned questioning. So where I say there, get clarity around what they want, ask them what they think the solution is. Questioning is a really key skill. That's what you are either already brilliant at or working towards being brilliant at. So I don't really want to tell you how to ask questions. What I would say is really focus on your listening. If you're going to get clarity around what they want, you've got to really listen to what it is that they're asking you. And if you do get into the switch to a teacher mode a little bit, then summarize your key thoughts and principles. Don't tell them to go and read Archbold or something. Help them out, be able to distill and summarize for them. Because if you have been listening to what they need, that should be more than possible to do. I will quite freely share with you as we come into ethics and confidentiality that I found it very hard to switch from the bar to doing a coaching qualification to becoming a coach, because I think I can say this, it's just a bit woollier than I was used to. So when I very first delivered a mentoring workshop in Chambers, they asked me all sorts of questions about, well, what if I discover that the mentee is an alcoholic? What do I do about that? Surely I have to go to the BASB. Do I have to do that immediately? Should I go to the head of Chambers first? All of which is not that likely to happen in a mentor relationship, I don't think. But it did prompt me to go and look at what the ethics and confidentiality in my current coaching profession is. And it's based on key principles. So it's about trying to do good, trying to avoid harm, respecting autonomy, being fidelity there, I would take for loyalty, but particularly in the sense of preserving confidentiality. Justice, I think I would translate to fairness, but again, have a think how you would interpret these. And self-respect, ensuring you don't end up doing things you're not comfortable with in both directions. So do think about that, because it's a relationship. Relationships throw up their own problems anyway, don't they? Of course. And this is a relationship with a specific purpose, and therefore potentially with specific problems. Now, one of the things that I think makes the biggest difference to my life, and particularly my life post-bar, is a habit of reflection. And I think this applies to mentoring. I think it applies to advocacy. I think it applies to legal knowledge. I think it applies to building your business and your commercial skills, your business development skills. I think it applies to your friendships and whether you get to the gym and whether you become a triathlon addict, that kind of thing. And I don't think we do this enough at the bar. This is another hobby horse I'm going to have to restrain myself on a little bit for time reasons. But I've just thrown up some questions there that might help people reflect individually or reflect together. And actually, if you reflect together, you're already getting into the feedback part, which I'm going to talk about next. So could you get into a habit of asking yourself, as the session comes to a close, what was helpful about that? Could you, as the mentor, directly say to them, what did you find helpful about that? Or looking at the second one, perhaps, is there something I could do differently next time that would be more helpful? Anything you would like to do differently next time? Perhaps you as the mentee are going to reflect and think, I turned up without any direction today. I didn't really have time to think about what I wanted. Can you see if there's anything else that would be useful for you to talk about? So you can do some of this on your own. You can do some of it in conjunction with feedback. I hope that you can see, because that might feel alien to some of you, but I hope you can see that if you got into that as a habit, it means you're not getting to the fifth session and thinking, well, this just is a massive waste of my time. Because hopefully you've set the boundary at the beginning and then you're addressing it as you go along also. Feedback. So the more formalized version of that, or certainly the part that involves both of you. What will the process be? How will you know when you've got to the end? How will you know if you've succeeded? Can you both be honest? And can you see it as a positive, even if it feels like a negative? So if they were to say to you, mentee was to say to mentor, actually, I felt like I didn't really get a chance to speak in that session. Could you both see it as an opportunity to learn and have a different style next time, rather than the mentor, for example, taking it personally and then wanting to just walk out and end the whole thing? You might be sitting there wondering, where has the FBI come into this? And that is because, and again, I didn't feel like I could share this, because one of the things I might need a mentor for is to understand what you can share that you found on the internet. But if you were to go away after this evening and Google FBI mentoring contract and tick the images box, you would find what purports to be, and it's from some sort of American business school, the slide, but it purports to be the FBI's mentoring contract. And the quote I've put at the bottom there is the way the FBI approach this. And what they say is, can you periodically, it says I will, to get you to sign to say I will, we will periodically discuss our process and relationship and take steps to enhance and develop it. Could you do that too? It does, it feels awkward at first. It's a bit of a short-term pain, long-term gain attitude, I think. I've said reflection is the thing that I think has made the biggest difference to my life in moving into that development space and learning about that sort of stuff. Feedback would be a very close second. When I go and work in non-barrister organisations, what I tend to say to them is, we don't get feedback at the bar, we get sacked, or we get another piece of instructions, another set of instructions. And if I did have a magic wand and I was going to change one thing, that would probably be it. We've talked about setting off well, we've talked about monitoring as you go. So let's just think briefly then about ending the relationship. I think I've again quoted from the FBI here. I've taken them from other contracts in any event. So could you, for example, agree at the beginning we'll have a 6-month mentoring relationship, but at the end of 6 months, or perhaps at 4 or 5 months, we'll determine whether or not it's beneficial to continue, and if so, what modifications may be necessary. If one of you gets to the point where you want to end the relationship before that proactively planned time period, then don't just walk away, don't just stop phoning, don't just stop emailing. Take the grown-up approach, the approach that fits with how you started, and discuss your viewpoints with the other person. And then, and this is from the FBI, if we decide to mutually end the relationship, we shall engage in an appropriate closure activity, I can't do the accent, that will focus on what we have learned from each other. So we won't just say thanks very much and walk away. We'll have another discussion, because maybe we've not just learned about advocacy and skeleton arguments and relationships with clerks. Maybe we've learned a bit more about how we learn and how we give help and how we take help. So can we sit down and have another grown-up conversation about that? There's a lot of being grown up, isn't there? It's quite hard to tell an audience you can't see that you should be grown up. And then I'll just go through the next few fairly quickly, because I do want to leave you some time for questions. If you were thinking about a mentoring scheme, you've got to give some thought to the matching. So if any of you were thinking of setting that up in chambers or an association you're involved with or something like that, then do have a think about the questions on that slide. You might also want to think about the questions on this slide, which are a bit more about thinking about the rules, the ground rules on a more scheme-wide level. So rather than the individual ones, will you, for example, make it a ground rule of that relationship that the agenda should be set in advance, that there should be feedback? So I suppose the scheme is taking some of the things we've talked about on a one-to-one level and formalising them. Because what you probably want if you've got a scheme is a degree of consistency. Okay, a couple of resources there. You'll recognise some of the names I've quoted there. If I was going to say one, the mentoring manual, I would say, by Julie Starr is it's great because it's short and it's simple, but also what Julie Starr does in both her mentoring manual and her coaching manual is she gives you a password and then you can access resources. So it has contracts on it. It has foundations for a mentoring scheme. What is mentoring? It has lots of really good stuff, which you can freely use if you've bought the book I Can't Pass On for Profit. See, following the law. Thank you for listening. It would be great to pick up on some questions now and also to connect. I was just going to finish with a quote. I do also feel in the world of the internet, I never know if these quotes are accurately attributed, but this was supposedly Benjamin Franklin, and it was, tell me and I forget, teach me and I may remember, involve me and I learn. And I think that's just a really good way of bringing together those themes about working as a pair. So if I stop sharing and pass the mic metaphorically back to the room.
Thank you very much, Cath. Can you hear me again now?
I can, yes.
Okay, fantastic. And I think hopefully people will be able to see me in the room as well. Thank you so much for that and for taking us through in the time we had available, such helpful tips to point us all in the right direction. Now, we've had some questions about where people can find mentoring resources and how they reach out to established practitioners, but we'll be sharing that towards the end. In terms of questions, I've seen some come through in the Q&As and I've refined one of them down to this. you talk about long-term and short-term mentoring, and it's certainly something I've struggled with to know which one I'm doing and why. Should that come from the mentee's aims or the mentor's availability, or does it have to be a match of both?
Oh, that is a good question. I think the way I would like to, in the ideal world, applying all this theory to the practical world, I think it would be thought about at the beginning. So what is this about? Is it about a period of transition or an application or just improving skills? And then I think you would try and then perhaps meet in the middle between the need and the time available, and probably go for that proactive approach we were talking about there. Shall we say that we make this a monthly conversation over 6 months, and shall we look at it at month 5 and see if you feel like you need more and I can see if I feel like I've got more time. So I wouldn't advise a mentor to commit to more than they know they can, because that would probably lead to quite an unsatisfactory ending. But I think having a commitment and then adapting as you both progress is probably the way forward.
And in terms of it coming from the mentee's perspective, you talked about them being prepared before the session. How wide would you say the focus should be for that mentee? Should it be addressing one particular question on an application form, for example, or should it be how do I get appointed as a part-time judge? As wide as that?
I think it could easily be as wide as that. Yeah, I think you could even, I'm probably constraining us a little bit by the examples I've given. I think you could, if you had somebody who was willing on the mentor side and keen to learn on the mentee side, you could say, can this be for my, I really want to have the best first 2 years of practice I possibly can. Can you help me through the various things that will happen in that 2 years? Bearing in mind everybody's time commitments and busyness and so on, it could absolutely be as narrow as one application. Yeah.
And we've had a couple of questions online about activities. Is this a situation with mentoring? Now we're learning that actually there are rules or guidelines for how it ought to be done, where you are just talking, or are there actual activities that you could do? And we're thinking about not only students wanting to become pupils, but junior practitioners wanting to progress, more senior practitioners maybe looking for appointments. Have you come across people doing particular activities together?
I have, in a relatively limited way, I would say, because again, we've got to, I think, be quite mindful about the burden on both sides, but particularly on the mentor, because I think we're after their wisdom, aren't we? We're after their experience, we're after their knowledge. I think for us to set them up to sort of deliver a course at the same time is probably something slightly different. Where I think it works really well is things like, well, you go off and plan that, you go off and draft your first version, and then on our next meeting, or come to your next meeting with the draft that you've done, and we'll have a look at that. Come to that meeting with your form, come to that meeting with the 3 interview questions that you are most struggling with. So in that sense, I think you can certainly bring in bits of life and bits of practical work. And there's nothing to stop you doing exercises, but I don't think you have to.
What about things like mock interviews? We know that's something that students ask for, but it's also people applying for positions as established practitioners are doing more and more. Is that something appropriate for a mentor to give feedback on, or does that cross a boundary potentially?
Potentially does. And I suppose my main concern about that would be, does your, and I mean this with the greatest of respect, but does your mentor know enough? Those panels are laws unto themselves to a degree. There are lots of specialist consultancies set up to help with them, particularly at the judicial end. So I think I'd be concerned about perhaps mixed messages, or perhaps just one fixed view coming through on that. I think for the ones that probably lots of us who are a bit older have done a lot, sort of recruitment interviews in chambers and so on, I think it probably can be very, very helpful. I suppose that if I had one of those textbook writers with us now, they might tell us it's not strictly mentoring, it's a mock interview. But I think it fits very nicely with a relationship if it fits with what both the mentor and the mentee wish.
Okay, anyone in the room have a question? Okay, we've got a few more online, so I'll just pick up some more. What if the relationship goes sour? What if there's bullying from either side in a meeting? Is it a case of you've got to resolve that at the start and then just end it, or is there a way to try and cure that situation?
Yeah, I think it's always hard if it's bullying and you don't feel able to speak up there and then. And I wouldn't encourage anyone to put themselves in a position where they didn't feel comfortable at that point. Having said that, if you could address it there and say, I don't feel very comfortable about that style of questioning, I don't feel very comfortable about the turn this conversation has taken, I think we could all spot in theory that that's probably the best thing to do. Might be very hard in practice. I would advise most people setting up schemes, if they are, to have a neutral point of contact, so that if you left that meeting feeling very unhappy, you would have somebody to go to and discuss your concerns, and you'd also have a neutral third party who could pick that up with the other party as well.
Okay, we had some questions about, well, isn't mentoring simply being a pupil supervisor and pupil? You were a pupil supervisor. In what ways do you see this as being differently beneficial to a senior and a junior practitioner? Yeah,
I mean, again, because I don't have to commit myself to writing a textbook, I think a pupil supervisor and the pupil is a classic. When I delivered that slide with Mr. Miyagi and Dumbledore, etc., the first time, my pupil supervisor was on it. I included her picture because she was a mentor for me. She fulfilled all of those roles. She challenged me. She let me control my learning. She asked me very powerful questions. So I think for people who've gone through that experience on either side, you can absolutely take loads from it. I think the most obvious difference, well, there's probably two obvious differences, but I think they're important. And one is that that's a very specific and limited in time purpose. And I think at the bar, we could probably do better at recognising how those benefits could go further into junior tenancy right through to senior practitioners making applications. So I think it's a microcosm of what could be a really good mentoring relationship. I think the other big difference is, of course, it's very specific, isn't it? You're going to court with them, you are watching what they do, you are doing perhaps papers on their behalf. Whereas if you find a mentor later or elsewhere, or even earlier, actually, you're much less likely to have that degree of involvement. So it's mentoring at, I don't know, Olympic standard or something, isn't it? It's all multiplied by a lot more intensity.
Okay, and we've had a question online which fits well with one of the questions we had in advance. The question in advance was how to overcome a weakness in speaking candidly while in a mentoring relationship for the fear of rejection, which I assume is coming from the mentee, but I could be wrong. And then there's also been a concern expressed online of senior barristers being hesitant to mentor, whether they feel intimidated about the changes that are happening. And as you talked about, some of the EDI issues that they're perhaps hesitant of getting wrong, essentially. You talked about short-term pain, long-term gain. Do you just have to try, or are there any tips you give to both sides of the relationship for approaching that challenging new way of working?
Yeah, I mean, there's I'm going to give you a fuller answer. There's a degree where it comes down to just being brave and recognizing that the consequences probably aren't going to be fatal. We can probably say that. And also, if you tackle it and you feel like you have a less than ideal result, then you're in a brilliant position to reflect and learn. That's my sort of short version. I think, at the risk of repeating myself, I think it's much easier to speak up or to avoid offending somebody, to take that very generally, if you do have that very open conversation at the beginning. And I think also if you front load, if you agree as a duo that you will ask me at the end how that went. And I think a really clever way to do it, which a coaching client of mine came up with actually, was to say, at the end of each session, I will tell you 2 things that went well and 2 things that didn't go so well. So you're committed then to that honesty framework. And then honestly, it does get easier.
Okay.
And I would say, can I just go back to that, the more senior people being a bit hesitant? I would strongly urge them just to take the plunge, because we could learn so much from having regular chats with somebody 3 decades younger. I said that with feeling, didn't I?
You did, Cath. Cath, while she's still with us before 7:15, I'm just going to ask for the slides from the inn to be shared, because we've had a number of questions about how do I find the right match for me? Now, I don't think what we're talking about today is just going and asking someone to be your mentor. I think we're talking about something more formal than that. And that's certainly what we're looking for more barristers at the inn to get involved with, is our mentoring scheme for students. But we've tried to, or the fantastic staff at the inn have tried to identify some other available options that we've found across the bar. And you may well find that there's a scheme in your inn as well, in your chambers as well. Now, whilst we're just waiting for those slides to come up, are you aware of whether judges are mentored? Someone's asked a question about that, and whether that's something that judges find helpful.
Yeah, Laura, you'll be more current on this than me, but certainly when I was junior, there were certainly judges who would, I don't know if you would necessarily formally call it mentoring, but they would, perhaps open up opportunities they would come into chambers, perhaps talk to people, or they would offer the opportunity to be marshalled and so on. As long as there's no conflict in terms of an application panel or something like that, then I don't see a difficulty with that. There's going to be a time difficulty, as there is with everything else, but certainly I can think of lots of part-time judges who mentor, so I don't think there should be a problem with that.
Okay, well, that's certainly, you mentioned there about marshalling, and again, if there are any judges watching, present, or if you're aware of anyone who's interested in getting more involved, the inn is also looking for more judges to sign up to the marshalling scheme. This is particularly something we're on a drive for at the moment, because students haven't been able to get many pupilages, or certainly not in the same number because of the pandemic. And it may even be that you're able to create a marshalling experience with an online hearing. We've all got used to Zoom and Teams and whatever it may be, so there is potential scope for organising some marshalling in that manner, still socially distanced. Now, in terms of the inn's mentoring scheme, as I say, it's for students at the moment. We are interested to hear if established practitioners would be interested in being linked up with another member of the inn. And on that point, Cath, in terms of finding the right mentor for you, should I be looking for somebody who's a more senior employment practitioner in the regions, or should I be looking for somebody totally different, or does it depend on where I want to go?
Yeah, I think it's the latter. I think that, well, depends on where you want to go and what you want to get out of the mentoring relationship. I think that's probably the first consideration. I would say, just to sort of put my softer skills hat back on, I think what we would do routinely in the commercial world of coaching and mentoring is have what we would call a chemistry session. Because I think what really matters is if you do think you'll be able to work well together, if you think you'll be able to get to that point of having honesty. And for many of you, I think probably what you'll want to do is get to the point where there's a blend, isn't there, between the chemistry of getting on and knowing that that person will challenge you enough to make this a really worthwhile process. I think you could get some amazing experience from, if you're in the regions, perhaps looking at London and vice versa. Perhaps you could even look at somebody who, we could learn a lot if we did a bit more cross-practice areas, I would humbly suggest.
Okay, well, we're having a little bit of an issue with sharing just our list of the mentoring schemes that we found, but they were cross-practice areas, they're across regions. They're, for example, in planning, property, public law sets specifically have grouped together. Here we go. It's up there. So
I was just looking for it on my copy. Go on.
There we go. Thank you very much. So we can see that we've set out about the mentoring scheme. It's a really good way in a supported environment for barristers who are more senior and have those concerns to be put in touch with an appropriate student. And now you've seen how to manage that relationship. It might give you some more confidence to do it. If we can go on to the next slide, please. Been wanting to say that. We've listed some of the mentoring schemes that we've found there. And same onto the final page. So for those of you that are interested, there are some starting points for people to have a look at outside of the inn. We will be sending out the recording, and we'll also be sending out the slides where this information is all available. And I think it's actually hyperlinked onto the mentoring schemes that we've identified. So I hope that covers the range of questions that we've been asked about finding an appropriate mentor and where to look. And I hope that's given people some insight into how you could mentor and why you ought to do it. So unless there are any further questions, thank you very much. I'd like to thank our speaker, Cath Brown, in the traditional way. Just to let you know that we are all here in the room, Cath, and then to close, I'll hand back to Clara.
Great, and I would just like to echo Laura's thanks to Cath for a brilliant session and to Laura for excellently chairing as well. The recording is on the website in the next couple of days, and any relevant resources that we've mentioned as well, such as the mentoring schemes and the links to those. And we do have a drinks reception for those attending in person. Thank you for coming along, and we hope you have a good evening.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Cath.
Thank you, Cath. Thank you very much.